Hello, BookTube. We're continuing with my library tour for 2024. We are still at base camp of bookcase number 2. In just a few weeks, we should be able to move on to shelf number 2 of bookcase number 2, but we are still on shelf number 1. And we're dealing with mass market paperbacks, all of which raise the question, could I actually read this? Not would I be able to stomach bad prose, but could I read this book, this physical collection of paper pages, before it blew apart on me? All of these books are more or less asking that question, even though some of them I have reinforced. And some of them I have actually read, so I know they can stand the strain. This first one is Godfrey Turton. This is his book, My Lord of Canterbury. It is, there you can see Henry VIII on the cover there. This is, once again, this cover art. Could this be the same guy? Who did we say his name was yesterday? No, this illustration is by Hector Garrido. But this is about Archbishop Cranmer. This is a historical novel about Archbishop Cranmer that tries to make him a towering hero of principle. I'm not really sure how you would do that. Certainly Turton does not succeed, but this is still a lot of fun. And a lot of the familiar characters of Tudor fiction cross these pages. A lot of them do. Henry VIII, of course, and Catherine of Aragon, but also Cromwell and the Duke of Norfolk and a bunch of others. Okay, then we have an enormous thing from, I want to say, the 1980s? 1987. This is by the newspaper columnist William Safire, who reached a certain point in his life when he could no longer comfortably do a deep knee bend and realized that he should write that windy historical novel that he's always wanted to do. I'm amazed that when he came to that decision and got in advance, it wasn't an Arthurian novel. Usually when male writers get to a certain point in their life, certain cholesterol count, they decide it's time to unlimber their Arthurian novel. But no, his was an American Civil War novel. This huge thing, Freedom is the name of it. A gigantic, multi-voice, panoramic novel of the American Civil War with a huge apparatus at the back that Safire referred to as the underbook, which is essentially one enormously long essay on the facts of this historical novel, where the novel differs from the actual historical record. So did Bill Safire originally just want to write a history of the American Civil War and thought no one would buy it, my agent couldn't sell it, some combination of those things? Or could he not content himself with simply writing a novel, the novel that every middle-aged man wants to write, and instead had to make you know that he also researched it? I don't know. I reviewed this at the time and strenuously proposed that no work of historical fiction should have anything like an underbook. That shouldn't exist. But it is there anyway. It's fairly lifeless prose. I think it's both an insult to Gore Vidal and a compliment to William Safire that this novel reads about as smoothly, about as well as Gore Vidal's Lincoln. Even though Vidal is one of the prose masters of the second half of the 20th century, and William Safire most certainly is not. So either Vidal was slumming it for Lincoln, which he admitted in interviews that he was, or Safire was at the top of his game. Either way, it's not that bad a read. I can't imagine. I've had this as a hardcover. Big drab gray hardcover. You see it at yard sales. I can't imagine reading it in a hardcover. The hardcover must weigh 6 pounds. The paperback's hard enough to imagine. I did read the paperback before I reviewed it. What is this next one? Oh, okay. This is Daphne du Maurier. This is her story of Francis Bacon. In this old, who was this? Avon did everything by Daphne du Maurier in these old paperbacks, all with a uniform design, uniform cover illustration. I know that this is a bit of heresy when it comes to this author, but I always prefer this author writing about historical subjects, either writing them straight nonfiction or fiction. I prefer it to her fiction. Okay, then we have a figure who has completely vanished from the literary world. Wow, 25 cents. So this was when, do I even want to know? This came out in 1957. Well, it was copyrighted in the 30s, I'm sure, because it was originally serialized. in a magazine. It's a historical novel. Does it say here? Yes, a short version of this novel first appeared in the serialized form in Argosy magazine 1935. It has been completely rewritten by the author. The author is Van Wyck Mason, and the book is Lysander, a historical novel about a valiant Greek who takes on the Persian Empire and wins a feisty Spitfire of a beautiful maiden in the process. It's a fantasia in some ways on ancient Greek history, and yet the most fantastical thing about it, the most outlandish claim anywhere in here is that opening one, that this was completely rewritten by the author. But it's a tiny little thing, takes you no time at all to read. It's gone, and so is everything else by this author, so I doubt it will ever be coming back, which is a bit of a shame. Okay. I guess on every shelf we're going to get something from Market Book Time with Elvis. This is the novelist John Wilcox, and this is his novel, The Horns of the Buffalo. A novel about the Battle of Rorke's Drift, which is, if you Google it, you will see it is an amazingly dramatic real-life moment. And this is all the people, if you know Rorke's Drift if you've seen either of the two big Zulu movies that were made once upon a time, either Zulu or Zulu Dawn, my preferred of the two. Then you'll know this. You'll know the details anyway. If you just Google it, and you'll see that it's begging to be made into a novel, and it has been fictionalized many times. Usually not in a standalone novel of its own. But I like this. This was a series, headline books. This was a series of imports. And this author did a whole bunch of novels that I quite like. But this is the only one I have. Okay, the next one is also from the 80s, yes? 1985, this is The Kingdom of the Wicked by Anthony Burgess. A follow-up to his novel Jesus of Nazareth, or Man of Nazareth, in which he tells a historical version of the life of Jesus. Decides to, what would I need to do to make this a believable story, as opposed to a gospel? And Burgess started to like the world, the ancient world that he researched to a fairly well to get the tone of that earlier novel right, that he decided to write this. This is basically Anthony Burgess writing the lives of the Caesars, the 12 Caesars by Suetonius. But there's a Christian thread running throughout here. Take a great novelist, and imagine that novelist mashing together Suetonius' 12 Caesars and the Acts of the Apostles, and that's what you get. That's what you'll get in this book. And it's delightful. Just utterly delightful. And ultimately moving by the end. A lesser-known creation by Burgess, but I think it's fantastic. Okay, then we have... so this is going to be historical fiction. It looks like a lot of this is just going to be historical fiction. This is Taylor Caldwell. This is Dear and Glorious Physician, with, once again, this cover art. Now, that has to be the same guy. What was his name? Talbot? Talbot or Tall or something? Oh no, it's not saying in here, but what was the one that we saw that did? It was Colleen McCullough, right, who actually credited this guy? This is certainly the same artist. Who have we got here? Cover illustration is what we want. Tom Hall. Tom Hall is the illustrator, but this has got to be this. That's got to be the same guy. But anyway, this is the story of St. Luke. This is Taylor Caldwell imagining a story for the name that is on the document, the Gospel According to St. Luke. Of course, no one named Luke wrote the Gospel According to St. Luke. That was a literary tradition, not an authorship attribution. But it doesn't matter, because this is still a terrific novel. This author did a handful of novels about biblical subjects. And I think they sing. I think they are her best things. I know that her big, opulent, historical stuff, the Captains and the Kings and whatnot, did better. But I think her book, she did a book in collaboration with Jess Stern called I, Judas. She did a book called The Great Lion of God. And she did this, Dear and Glorious Physician. I think they're all much, much better. I even would give rank to a novel that she wrote about Cicero. I would even give preference to that over a lot of her historical sudsers. Okay, then we have the aforementioned Gore Vidal. This is his novel Julian. I mentioned this a couple of times. This is more wraparound mass market cover artwork of a type you just don't get anymore. This is his historical novel about Julian the Apostate, about the Roman emperor, the late Roman emperor, who wanted to turn the empire back away from Christianity, back towards pagan worship. And it's wonderful. Absolutely wonderful. In a lot of ways, it put Vidal on the map in terms of being a Book of the Month Club friendly historical novelist, someone who could sell a shed load of books, as opposed to being an esthete New York reading experience. And that can help. That really helps the bottom line of your career. I love the cover. Can't imagine why. Although it did confuse me at the time when I got this paperback came out, I think, again, in the 80s. Valentine, 1986. When I saw this in the bookstores, I thought, all right, well, where's Julian? Why isn't he on the cover of his own book? Then I realized that young man right there is supposed to be Julian. I'm almost certain of it. Even though the Emperor Julian actually wrote a whole book about being heavily bearded. So it's kind of weird. Okay, more historical fiction. Gore Vidal's name at least will be known to you. This name is probably not. And he's great. He never wrote a bad historical novel. This is Alfred Duggan, and this is his book Three's Company. I want to go back in time using my TARDIS and tell the author that my services are available to title a book any time of the day or night, free of charge. Nevertheless, he called this Three's Company. This is about the power struggles that tore apart the Roman Republic and laid the groundwork for the Roman Empire. And it's amazingly good. All of his stuff, all of Duggan is amazingly good. Okay. Well, this next one is not historical fiction. This is a great novel. And here we have yet another. We saw this with the House of God, 1980. No credit for the cover, but it's the same kind of salacious cover design. This is Jeremy Levan, and this is his novel Creator, which we have a shapely leg poking out of an egg there, and then we have an inset gatefold here where we see certain aspects of the book. The cover alludes to the fact that the main character in this book is trying to clone his dead wife because he loved her so much that he doesn't want to live in a world where she doesn't exist. And it goes on from there. It explodes in all directions to the point where you wonder if the main character of this book isn't in fact imaginary, isn't in fact making up the main character of an ongoing written narrative that he himself creates. So is Harry Walper real and he's creating Boris Lafkin? Or is Boris Lafkin the guy who's imagining Harry Walper? And what does any of this have to do with parthenogenesis, with making life from nothing? It's wonderful. Absolutely wonderful. It is one of the... I mentioned in this library tour that it's tempting to make a reading list, to make a greats list of post-war American fiction. So the second half of the 20th century and the 21st century up until 2024. If you were to make a list like that, who would be on it? And this would be on that list, even though no one's ever heard of it, even though it's out of print, will never come back in print, nobody reads it, nobody knows about it. Oh, all right, and this is another version of Creator. This is a movie cover. This was made into a movie with Peter O'Toole and Mariel Hemingway and a young actor named Vincent Spano. David Arthur Stiers is in here as well. He's hilarious. And there's no way that you could make a movie of the novel. There's no way that you could do that. So the creators of this movie, no pun intended, who actually directed this? The screenplay was by Jeremy Levan, and that's the only way that this would work. Is it Stephen Friedman? Well, anyway, Jeremy Levan takes a fraction of his book and sanitizes it for the movie, makes a story out of it for the movie. It's still about a professor who's trying to clone his dead wife, but all the rest of the stuff that's in the book is not in the movie. And a couple of little details are in the movie that aren't in the book. And they're very touching. So I guess that's why I have them both. Okay, then we have Peter Mathiasson again. This is his book, Far Tortuga, which has the original weird type font and weird spot illustrations all throughout. This is a very, very strange novel about turtle fishermen, legal and illegal, and the weird world that they occupy, and it's great. I said when we came across At Play in the Fields of the Lord, I mentioned that At Play in the Fields of the Lord is a very, very good novel, but not a great one. This is a great one. This is, in my opinion, the only great novel this author ever wrote, and it's toweringly great. It would also be on that list of 70 years of post-war American fiction. It would be on that list. Even though it's a very surreal reading experience, well worth pointing that out. It is not normal as a book. It takes a while for you to get used to it, stylistically. Okay, here's another one. Wow. All right, this author was once upon a time known, actually got invited to literary events, featured on the periphery of the New York Times bestseller list, was reviewed by serious reviewers. He is now completely forgotten, but he also wrote one of those great books. He wrote a great book of that time period. The author is Vance Bourgeois, and this is his novel Now Playing at Canterbury, which nominally, on the surface, on one level, is about a certain Midwestern university. It'll be extremely recognizable to any of you who've ever been to Iowa City. A certain Midwestern university that is trying to put on an original opera. And the opera's composer, the somewhat waspish, imperious director of the university's opera program. I know this, I am preaching to absolutely no one here. I am talking mainly to myself again, but I will mention just for posterity that the name Beaumont Glass does not appear in this book. Oh my. But the university hires a seedy, down-at-heels, itinerant freelance director to get the product off the ground. And that's a clash right there. We get deeply into the lives of all the people involved, the most unlikely tenor in the world, all the people behind the production of this opera. And we get into the life of that seedy director as well. We kind of root for him as the most unlikely hero imaginable. This is amazing. It is absolutely amazing. It is totally forgotten, and that's a shame. Okay, then we saw, this has schmutz on it. All these things have schmutz on it. I wonder if the bookcase is causing the schmutz. We saw Julian, by Gore Vidal. Julian, by Gore Vidal, was a response to a blockbuster. Gore Vidal would never admit it. None of the authors who wrote these things would ever admit it. But Julian was a response to the success of I, Claudius. And so is this book. This is by Robert Graves, and it is Count Belisarius in this Penguin volume that has no artwork on it at all. This is the story of the Roman general Belisarius, a general under Emperor Justinian who did his best to reconquer a lot of the lands that Rome had lost to deterioration and barbarian invasion. Had he had a little bit more material at his back, he certainly had the genius to do it. He had abundant amounts of literary genius. And Graves wrote a book about him that is almost completely static. It's kind of a weird reading experience. It just sits there on the page. And when you're reading it, I was thinking, well, isn't this odd that this is so static when I, Claudius, and Claudius the God were so full of energy? And then we went back to I, Claudius, and Claudius the God, and they're not really. Something is happening there, but they are still very stodgy. People have not come to grips with Robert Graves. Among the many, many other figures that I'm talking about here, people have, the literary world, I don't think the literary world cares, nor in the 21st century is it allowed to care about a white man. But even before that, people like Robert Graves, or even Van Wyck Mason, the literary world has not come to terms with these things at all. Instead, they've just let them go. Let's move on. When there was a whole body of literature that we all lived and breathed in for decades and decades, talked about it, wrote about it, cared about it, and great works were written in it. And now, Robert Graves, I think sometimes you can, Penguin Classic made a deluxe edition of The Greek Myths, of all things. They've never seen fit to do a deluxe edition of I, Claudius and Claudius the God, his most successful books, and I would say that is true not only commercially, but also artistically. And what about the rest of the stuff that he wrote? Or any of these people? So anyway, I don't want to keep ranting. Let's just move on. The next one is another Marco Polo novel. We saw one already that was a quickly churned out companion to a TV miniseries. This is a thing of an entirely different order. This is adventure writing of the very first quality. This is Gary Jennings, The Journeyer. Again, with an amazing cover. Just rolls on and on, all sorts of details. This follows Marco Polo on his adventures on the other side of the world with the Khan and the Khan's enemies. It follows him back to Venice. It deals with his youth, the vigorous middle age. It's wonderful, just wonderful, totally engrossing, just 100% engrossing. This mass market paperback is absolutely full of blurbs from critics who read this in the huge hardcover. This is a big book. It's the paperback is over 1,000 pages long, and critics loved it. Absolutely. It's so controlled that they loved it. They'd been primed to love it, but even so, they loved it. Okay, this next one is by Stephen Marlo. This is The Shining. Not Stephen King's The Shining, but Stephen Marlowe's The Shining, about Xenophon and his expedition up country, his expedition, his doomed expedition that was trying to hack and slash its way out of Persia. Marlo wrote a novel called The Shining about it back in the 60s. Is that right? Yeah, 1963. And it's really good. Stephen Marlo just himself, just in general, is really good. His big book on Columbus, I never see it used at all. I never see it. But his book on Columbus is so good. It's so funny. This has bits of humor in it, but this is far more under the influence of Mary Renault, so this is far more serious. And you notice there are no other stickers on any other books. I left these two stickers on here because one is the Brattle Bookshop and the other is Avenue Victor Hugo, which is a now defunct Boston used bookstore that I used to go to all the time. So I figured there was kind of a mosaic of Boston used bookstores going on here. Plus, I figured this is very cheaply made. You can see the text box already pulling off the spine. I don't think that I could read this. So I guess I envisioned that somewhere down the line, not far down the line, I will just be saving the cover because the book will fall apart. I honestly don't think this would take a read, even one read. And then we can finish up with another huge historical novel. This is also hundreds and hundreds of pages, almost over 700 pages long. This is Ian Pierce. The great big book that he had inside him wasn't Arthurian. It was this, An Instance of the Fingerpost, where he takes an incident from a couple of centuries ago and narrates it elaborately from 4 different viewpoints. And each of those narrators is not unreliable in the outre antic sense of making things up. Instead, they're unreliable in the way that all of us are. In that they're going to emphasize some things over others. They're going to just plain miss things. They're not going to be smart enough to see the significance of some things. And you move from one whole account of the events at the heart of this story in the first part of this book to the second part of this book that gives you that whole story all over again from the viewpoint of someone who was in the first retelling but is now doing the telling themselves. You get sometimes a drastically different viewpoint. It's amazingly done. It's amazing not only the things that stay the same, but the tiny little details that change. And that's not the point of the book. That's the virtuoso part of the book. But the point of the book is a plot. Believe it or not, Pierce works a plot throughout all of that. It's a big undertaking as a book, but it is really, really good. And there you go. We are done with another subsection. I believe this is subsection C of bookcase number 1, bookshelf number 1 of bookcase number 2. I'm losing track of all these things here. We're going to move on. We have ever so much more to go, so I will wrap this up for now, and I will see you next time. Thank you, BookTube.